The top business stories live from the Sky News City studio. Ready for takeoff. The first long-haul commercial air flight using 100% sustainable aviation fuel. Shares of the aircraft engine maker Rolls-Royce jumped by 6% as it unveils new profit targets. Plus, why the UK could be the deep tech epicentre of Europe. Good morning, this is Business Live with me, Ian King. We start today with news about Rolls-Royce, and the aircraft engine maker said today that it expects to sell between £1 to £1.5 billion worth of assets during the next 5 years. It said the move was aimed at reallocating capital to areas where it could generate a better financial return. Well, the news came as Rolls unveiled new financial targets for the period. It's aiming to achieve an annual operating profit of up to £2.8 billion by 2027, with the biggest improvement being targeted in its civil aerospace arm. The shares have jumped by 6% on that news. Staying with aviation, and easyJet has returned to the black after reporting a record summer, and it's resumed paying dividends to shareholders. The airline reported a pre-tax profit of £455 million for the year to the end of September, compared with a loss of £178 million during the previous 12 months. The majority of this came from its core airline business, although just over a quarter of it came from easyJet's growing holidays arm. But it warned that results in the financial year, which has just started, would be affected by the conflict in the Middle East. easyJet has paused flights to Israel and Jordan and said that these, along with Egypt, account for 4% of its capacity. The shares are ahead right now by just over 2.5%. And Pets at Home reported a big drop in half-year profits today, reflecting the cost of investing in a new distribution centre in Stafford and the associated disruption around the opening. The retailer and veterinary services provider reported a pre-tax profit of £34.7 million for the 28 weeks to the 12th of October. That was down 35% on the same period last year. But the company said it was still confident of hitting its full-year targets and added that it had already seen an uptick in sales in the run-up to Christmas. The shares are up by just under 1% right now. Well, stocks fell on Wall Street last night, but all three major US stock indices, the S&P 500, the Nasdaq and the Dow, are all on track for the best monthly performances in more than a year. Well, that was followed by mixed trade in equities overnight in the Asia-Pacific region. The Hang Seng in Hong Kong fell by almost 1% on news that home prices in Hong Kong fell last month to their lowest level in more than 5 years. Well, in Europe right now, stocks are, again, pretty mixed right now. The IBEX in Madrid, the only main continental index in positive territory right now. Comments from European central bank officials over the last 24 hours are weighing on sentiment. Talking points this morning include Atomos, the French IT services company, is down by 7% in Paris following a downgrade to its credit rating from S&P. Well, here in London, the FTSE 100 also in negative territory, off by just over 1/3 of 1%, with healthcare heavyweights weighing on the index. In percentage terms, well, the biggest faller this morning is Pearson, the educational publisher. That's been hit by broker comment this morning. Some of the stocks with Hong Kong exposure, including HSBC and Prudential, are also lower on that housing data. To the upside, well, the star performer, no doubt about, well, there you go, there are the fallers I've just mentioned. To the upside, Rolls-Royce is ahead by 6.5% right now on its new profit targets. Outside the FTSE, the leading mid-cap gainers right now are easyJet and Pets at Home, which I mentioned just now, both of them obviously on the back of trading updates today, while the food and drink extracts and ingredients specialist Treat is ahead by 2.25%, following a 14% rise in underlying full-year pre-tax profits. On the foreign exchange markets, well, the main story continues to be around dollar weakness. So as you can see, the US dollar this morning hit its a 3-month low against a basket of currencies before steadying. Sterling right now more or less unchanged against the dollar and the euro. Meanwhile, the euro unchanged against the dollar as well. The oil price, meanwhile, continues to trade in a very narrow range ahead of this week's OPEC Plus meeting. A barrel of Brent crude will currently cost you $80.68 a barrel. That is up a little under 0.9% on the session. Well, joining me this morning is Guy Ellison. He's head of listed equities at Investec Wealth and Investment. Guy, good to see you this morning. Let's start with Rolls-Royce, because the market loves what it's hearing out of the company today.
Yes, as you say, the standout mover in the UK market this morning, but also one of the standout movers for the UK over the course of this year. It's nice as we get to this point in the reporting season where most companies have already updated. We're getting a few capital market days now where companies take investors in more depth through their plans for the medium term. One ongoing from Novartis today. And as you mentioned, the one from Rolls-Royce, the shares have nearly trebled over the course of this year. And it's on the back of a couple of drivers. One is a new management team, which certainly appears to have got their arms around some of the cost issues and some of the forecasting challenges that comes with a business like Rolls-Royce. But we've had two very significant upgrades over the course of this year to near-term earnings expectations, and those took Rolls up 20% on each individual day when they occurred. Today's update is more looking into the medium term, as you say, out to 2027, the company's financial forecast, but also the unveiled scale of disposals that the company plans to deliver over the next couple of years as well. But all being well received by the market. Rolls in a sweet spot at the moment. It's seeing demand for its civil aerospace engines recover post-COVID, and it's doing all the right things in terms of meeting or exceeding near-term profitability targets.
Yes, it's had a rough old run over the last few years. Nice to have some good news out of that one. Now, what about EasyJet? Again, you could say the same of the EasyJet. Yeah,
some of the same factors at play. It's that post-COVID recovery, pent-up demand for travel coming through. EasyJet's just reported its full-year numbers to September. That includes, crucially, that final quarter of the year, July, August and September, which for EasyJet and Northern Hemisphere business coincides with the summer holidays and peak demand. And they closed out a very strong year. As you mentioned, a slight tone of caution around some of those Middle Eastern routes heading into the winter season. But a strong set of numbers, a resumption of a dividend from EasyJet next year. It's been several years since we've seen one of those. Sales for the year up by around 50% and profits nearly doubling.
Turning to the macro guy, I get a sense of caution in the wind right now. Obviously, we're waiting to see what the Federal Reserve has to say on US inflation later this week. But a couple of comments overnight from the ECB. I mean, Christine Lagarde yesterday saying the war on inflation is not yet won. I mean, is that weighing on the indices generally right now?
On balance, I think the market is taking the view that certainly in the US and the UK, we probably have reached peak interest rates for this cycle, though the central bankers won't admit that just yet. The ECB probably in a slightly different position where it feels there is more to be done from a rate tightening perspective to get inflation firmly back under control. But either way, for all of the Eurozone, for the US and for the UK, the prognosis economically for 2024 at the moment looks fairly challenging. It's going to be a year of, at best, very subdued growth, around 1% in the US, less than that in the UK, and a real possibility that any of those markets and individual countries within Europe slip into recession. So the central bankers, as ever, have got to balance that risk of taking too much momentum out of the economy, but at the same time not letting inflation start to re-emerge.
I mean, it's been a terrific November for equities. I mean, the Nikkei in Tokyo's up 8.5% nearly. All the US stock indices have had their best month of the year. Is there going to be a bit more to be squeezed out of before the end of the year?
We'd like to think so. Typically we do see a bit of a Santa rally into the year end. But in part, it's going to be very data dependent. And this week is a big one. That core PCE number from the US, I think, will dictate sentiment. But it seems unlikely that anything will come along to challenge the narrative that we are at peak rates, certainly in the US and the UK for this point in the cycle. And that should lend a fairly decent tailwind to equities as we head to the year end.
All right, Guy, got to leave it there. Good to see you this morning. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Now, the first plane to fly a long-haul commercial flight across the Atlantic Ocean using only sustainable aviation fuel is about to take off. Until now, regulators have only allowed airlines to use a maximum of 50% eco-fuel to power their engines. But today's test flight from London Heathrow to New York's JFK Airport will be powered 100% by sustainables like cooking oil and plant-based products. Well, there we go. That's the picture now of Heathrow. Looks like the aircraft is doing a bit of taxiing there. My colleague Jonathan Samuels is actually on board the aircraft. We're expecting to hear from him later on during the flight. Lovely sunny day there at Heathrow as well. I suspect a bit chilly. Well, joining me now to talk about this while we await takeoff is the sustainability and carbon emissions expert and researcher at the University of Lancaster, Mike Berners-Lee. Mike Berners-Lee, welcome to you. Is this just a gimmick or is there actually something serious happening here?
Well, the climate change impact of this one particular flight will be somewhat lower than a conventional fossil fuel powered flight, but actually only somewhat because there's still carbon emissions associated with creating aviation fuel from waste cooking oil, and also all the high altitude factors that are the climate change impact of burning the fuel at high altitude, which is such a big part of the climate change impact of flying, will be exactly the same as for fossil fuels. So it's probably got maybe 2/3 of the climate change impact or something like that of a conventional flight. And the other thing to say is that even if you took all the world's cooking fuel and converted it into so-called sustainable aviation fuel, you could only power something like 2 or 3% of the world's flights. So it's worth having, but it's absolutely not a game changer at all for aviation.
Mike, you've just put your finger on a key point which I hear time and again from the industry, which is that not only is there enough of this stuff available, but also manufacturing it and refining it right now is also a real headache.
Yeah, so there's nowhere near enough cooking oil, and turning it into aviation fuel has quite a big carbon footprint. But even if you use other biofuels, so plant-based crops to create the fuel, then supposedly you could create more biofuel. But the trouble there is that the pressure on land is so enormous. So to give a sense of scale on this, if you wanted to create this so-called sustainable aviation fuel for the whole of the EU's aviation fuel requirement, it would require a land area of twice the whole of the UK and Ireland just to grow the crops for that fuel. So actually the phrase sustainable aviation fuel is a bit of a misnomer, I'm afraid. There's unfortunately no silver bullet around flying. We can fly in a more sustainable world, but we're going to have to do so somewhat less. There's no getting around that.
Mike, perhaps one other thing that you'd be able to clear up for us. Until now, only flights with 50% sustainable aviation fuel have been allowed to take off. Why has that changed today? What's changed to allow this to happen?
Okay, so this will be just to do with safety regulations and to do with, confidence that this can be done in a way that meets the, quite rightly, very high safety standards of the aviation industry. So, in a sense, this marks a small step forward, but it would be absolutely wrong to say that this is in any way paving the way for a game-changing perspective on the carbon impact of flying. The issue with flying is that a very, very small percentage of the world's population flies a lot. And in a more sustainable world, we could quite happily have all of us flying occasionally. Most of the aviation impact is a few people doing a lot of flying.
Mike, what about other alternative forms of powering aircraft? I mean, one hears a lot about battery technology. What sort of stage in its development is that right now when it comes to aviation?
Well, there are a few different technologies here. They're all problematic, but they're all coming together sort of slowly. The trouble with batteries is that they weigh so much, and the more the battery weighs, the more power you need to put the aircraft into the air. And so there becomes a sort of a limit to the distance that you can have for a battery-powered flight. So it looks as though for short-haul flights, batteries might be getting there. For longer-haul flights, the most promising technologies are either hydrogen, but hydrogen has got such a huge volume that you have to completely redesign the aeroplane in order to put the fuel on board. So a hydrogen-powered long-haul flight probably wouldn't physically look anything like the aeroplane that we're seeing in the picture at the moment. And the other main possibility at the moment is ammonia, which has got the advantage that it's much more dense than hydrogen, and you can create it from hydrogen. And so that might be the secret to more sustainable long-haul flights in the future. But we've still got to ask where the energy is going to come from to create the hydrogen and the ammonia. So there's still going to be a bottleneck on flying, however we look at it, although there are technologies underway, quite a long way off, that will somewhat ease the situation over the coming decades, we hope.
Quite so. Mike, you've just raised another really interesting point there. Ammonia, I mean, I did A-level chemistry 35 years ago, so I'm a bit rusty, and I suspect the viewers will be as well. Talk me through how ammonia could be used to power a commercial flight.
Well, the challenge with fuel for an aeroplane is that you need to have enough energy in it to power the plane all the way across the Atlantic, say. And you need to have that energy stored in a way which, on the one hand, is compact enough that you can fit it onto the aeroplane, and on the other hand, is light enough so that you don't weigh the energy, that you don't weigh the plane down so much that it can't take off and can't make the distance. Because the heavier the aeroplane is, the more fuel it requires to keep it in the air. So ammonia is kind of a nice compromise. I mean, the thing about fossil fuel is it does have the advantage of it's incredibly compact, it's very high energy, and it's also a liquid, so you can just pour it into the wings. Whereas hydrogen, it's much higher volume, and you have to store it in cylinders, which makes it just impossible to put in a conventionally styled aeroplane. But ammonia has a huge advantage that it's much more energy dense than hydrogen, and you don't have to store it in pressurized cylinders in the same way. And so it's possible to put it into a conventional aeroplane and power it just about across the Atlantic. Possibly not all the way to Hong Kong in one go, but you can get a pretty good long-haul flight out of it.
But what's the chemistry involved in it, Mike? I mean, I think it's one nitrogen atom and three of hydrogen from memory. Okay. So how does that power the aircraft?
Okay, so you've off the top of my head, you get me on the physics now, but there's a chemical reaction process that will release a huge amount of energy, and that's enough to power the turbines. Okay.
Do you detect much? Really interesting what you said just now about hydrogen powered flights. I mean, it will involve, as you say, a complete redesign of a lot of these aircraft. I don't detect much enthusiasm on the parts of the likes of Boeing and Airbus to embark on something like that.
No, I think realistically, we're talking quite a long way down the line, because aircraft, the conventional shape of an aircraft would have to be completely different. I mean, the shape of the wings, you'd be talking about a different kind of aerofoil. And aircraft have a long lifetime. It takes a lot to build them, and once you've built them, you want them to last a few decades. So I think for that reason, that hydrogen-powered long-haul flights are going to be quite a way off, and ammonia may be a more pragmatic solution over the next couple of decades. But it's absolutely not going to be so-called sustainable aviation fuel from plant-based biofuels, because of the pressure on land that puts. We've only got so much land in the world, and with all that land, we need to feed the world and look after nature and deal with climate change. And it's creating a lot of biofuel just puts far too much pressure on the whole land system.
Implicit in what you're saying, Mike, is that the cost of aviation, if we are to switch to fossil-free, is going to go up for everyone.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we can talk about how that happens. It need not be for everybody's first flight. I mean, one very interesting idea is that we have a flight price escalator. So you get your first flight for a certain amount, and your second flight costs you a bit more, and your third flight starts to cost you quite a lot more. And by the time you're up to 5 flights, your fifth flight costs you a lot more money than your first one. And that will be a way of redistributing the way that flying happens, so that everybody can fly for a really good reason. Maybe it's an annual short haul flight, and maybe it's a long haul flight every now and then. But people are very strongly disincentivized for just going off for a weekend shopping trip or stag weekend or whatever. Good point. There's the hard reality of aviation. If you look at all the technologies required for transition to a sustainable energy economy, actually, aviation is probably the toughest nut to crack in all of it. And for that reason, we have to bite the bullet and say it's the one area where we're actually going to have to really exercise some restraint and share around the flying that we can have. We need to share it round a bit more, so that we're not saying to ordinary people, you can never fly.
OK, well, here we go, Mike. The plane is taking off. As I say, Sky's Jonathan Samuels is on board here, and we'll be hearing from him later on during the flight. It's amazing. It doesn't matter how many times you've seen an aircraft take off, but it really is something special to behold, isn't it?
Still a miracle that that lump of metal can actually be in the air. I agree.
Mike, it's been fascinating talking to you this morning. I mean, the one thing that just strikes me is with the growing wealth around the world, the growing demand for travel, particularly in countries like China, countries where civilians have only really just had the financial firepower to be able to afford even short-haul flights, and the infrastructure that's been built up around that, the aircraft, as you say, that are being manufactured, it feels a very, very long way away before we get anything like a full transition away from fossil fuels with aviation.
Yes, it does. It's going to be the hardest part of the whole economy to move away from fossil fuels, and that's why we need to be so careful with it. But just to come back to your point about the developing world, I mean, at the moment, 90% of the world population never ever flies, and even in a rich developed country like the UK, every year the majority of us, about 60% of us, will still. Only about 60% of us will get on an aeroplane. So, and as I said, most of the flying emissions will just be from a very small proportion of the people, even within the UK. So the question about how we share around who gets to fly and how much is really, really critical.
OK, Mike, we have to leave it there. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you today. Thank you for joining me and talking us through those pictures. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now, at the UK government's second Global Investment Summit, which was held yesterday, the Prime Minister highlighted the UK's tech sector as being one of the main attractions for overseas investors. Well, that was backed today by research published by Digital Catapult, the government-backed agency that seeks to accelerate the adoption of new and emerging technologies. It reports that a quarter of more than 1,200 early-stage investors from the UK, France, Germany, Netherlands and Spain regard the UK as the deep tech epicentre of Europe. Well, joining me now is Dr. Jeremy Silver, the Chief Executive of Digital Catapult. Jeremy, good to see you again. For the uninitiated, you better explain what deep tech actually is.
Well, good morning, Ian. Deep tech is, I suppose, the application area that is at the heart of what we're talking about when we talk about artificial intelligence, when we talk about 5G, for example, or immersive technologies. It's the underlying enabling technologies and the innovation that happens there, rather than the application of that into the consumer space or into industry, for example.
And which are the hottest areas of deep tech that investors are most interested in right now?
Well, you won't be surprised to know that it's artificial intelligence, and particularly generative AI, which has been causing such a furore in the last few weeks and months. Since ChatGPT was launched last November, I don't think I've had a single conversation that hasn't involved AI. But there are other technology areas as well. So although it's not so fashionable to talk about the metaverse anymore, the fact is that a lot of people are still interested in that. And digital twins, which are associated technologies, spatial computing more broadly is how you might refer to that. So there are some other really important areas emerging, as well as AI.
And of course, quantum computing.
And a little bit further out, a little bit less predictable from an investment perspective, but quantum is definitely coming, yes.
Well, you mentioned investment there. I mean, obviously, we're in a completely different environment than we were, say, in 2021, when you saw money pouring into VC. Are attitudes of investors changing? Have they become more risk-averse as a result of this?
We're definitely seeing the impact of the economic headwinds everywhere in the investment community, and that includes in the early stage and the seeds. I think we're seeing probably a halving of the level of investment. So there's still plenty of money around, but nowhere near as much as there was. At the mid-cap and the growth phases, we're seeing quite a reduction in valuations. Fortunately, that's not the case, actually, in the earlier stage. We're not seeing that quite so much. But I think probably at least 30% of the investors that we surveyed across Europe said that the economic factors were affecting their decisions.
And of course, companies themselves are having to conserve cash more. Is that it's hindering their ability to invest in growth as much as they would like?
For the companies themselves, the challenge always for early stage businesses is how much runway and how much capitalization can they acquire. And I think the challenge in the UK has always been that companies tend to be undercapitalized compared with the US. Our ability to scale fast is inhibited because of that. And so, yes, under these circumstances, that becomes more challenging.
Now, what is going to keep the UK at the forefront of deep tech? Because Germany, according to your research, is very much snapping at the UK's heels.
I think that's right. We were, and we still are, the lead across all of Europe. We still receive more early-stage investment than any other country in Europe. But Germany is approaching fast. In France, the enthusiasm is very high. In the end, the reliance that we have is very much on our research base and on the quality of our universities and the graduates that come out of those universities. It's not necessarily spin-outs from the universities themselves, but that community, that ecosystem of graduates that come out of particularly our leading universities, they're the ones that are really producing the big impact in terms of creating really exciting businesses.
All right, Jeremy, we have to leave it there. It's good to see you again this morning. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian.